mentioned the myth in terms of it affecting African Americans, and we're all sitting around the table, African Americans. But why is that such a myth?
I think first we want to back up and say how sickle cell disease can be inherited and to differentiate it from sickle cell trait. Sickle cell trait means that someone carries the recessive gene, the capacity to pass on that gene to their offspring. In order for a child to have actual disease, as in Wanda's case, both parents must have at least trait. And then when they have a child, there's about a 25% chance that that child will have sickle cell disease and about a 50% chance that they will have trait. Now, the difference between trait and disease are that with trait, typically it's not manifesting the disease complications. However, there have been some studies, and again, when we have Dr. Nguyen with us, she can speak more specifically to it. There have been some studies that have noted that when people who have trait are in certain altitudes or under certain conditions, that somehow the trait can begin to mirror the actual disease. And I think you might see that too when we look at the literature that speaks to when people are under strong physical duress. So I'm reminding myself of a situation where Howard University worked with the military in terms of supporting their training regimens so that people with trait could in fact move through their training appropriately without having any significant complications. They were seeing some assimilations to that. We know recently there were also some studies that shown that some football players under certain physical distress who had trait were having some significant complications as well.
Okay, now you get distinguish between the trait and also the full-blown disease.
Correct.
What are some of the myths about it?
One is that it only impacts Black people or African Americans, which you touched on earlier. It absolutely can be found in all ethnicities. Again, it goes back to what we talked about previously, about it being something that doctors are now believing and are pretty sure that it relates to where malaria was greatest, where there was a concentration of malaria. That's where the disease mutated, and this is where we're now finding it. It impacts people from those areas of the world.
So why is it then when we think about sickle cell disease, if it affects people worldwide, in this country we specifically think about African Americans?
And I wonder if it's something to do with our history here in the United States of America. More specifically, the disease was initially diagnosed in 1910 by Dr. James Herrick. Now, mind you, that was just the formal name of sickle cell disease being given to it, whereas in African tribes, they've always known about the disease years before then. So in this country, we're now celebrating here in September 102 years of recognizing sickle cell disease. I believe what's added to the misconception is that with the concentration of African slaves being brought in, it raised the probability of the disease probably showing up in one particular group here in the United States, where today, we have more data that suggests and identifies that there are many people, even here in the United States, who are living with sickle cell disease. I believe
who are not African American.
Who are not African American, thank you. So I believe some of the most recent data that I saw that's coming out of the National Institute for Health are that there's about 1 in every 425 African Americans who may have sickle cell disease. It may be 1 in 1,100 to 1,400 Hispanic Americans. And then I believe the numbers are even like 1 in every 58,000 Caucasians may have sickle cell disease.
Now, would this have anything to do with intermarriage, for example? I mean, that's the first thing that might come to mind when you talk about the disease affecting people other than African Americans.
Well, I would, again, Dr. Nguyen can speak more specifically to this, but I would think that that is definitely a myth as well, because the disease is found in many Mediterranean, East Indian, and other cultures. I believe as we migrate, so even within the particular ethnic groups themselves, the disease is repopulating. But again, as they do continue to interface with other nationalities, it does raise the probability of there being more disease in different ethnic groups.
So let's try it again to see if we have Dr. Nguyen with us.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi.
You're there,
Now I
Dr.
can hear
Nguyen?
you great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. It's
Oh,
very
good.
low, but we can hear you. Can
Okay.
you hear us?
I will try to speak a little bit louder. Is that better?
Oh, yes, that's so much better.
Great.
So, do you have any comments on what we just now said? I had asked if the origins of the disease, why we associate it so much with African Americans, especially if it's a worldwide disease, and if there might be because of an African influence globally.
Yes, I did hear some of that, and I don't know. I missed the beginning of the talk, so I don't know if we talked about how people who are born with one copy of the mutation actually had a survival advantage because of malaria.
No, we really didn't talk about that in any depth at all. So,
Okay.
do talk about that.
Sure. So we think of sickle cell as a disease, as a bad thing, but the reality is human beings evolved with malaria for millions of years before the United States or before modern medicine came to being. And so if you look at areas of the world where malaria is endemic, and malaria has been for thousands and thousands of years, what you're talking about is sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. So that's northern Africa, southern Europe, Italy, Turkey, the Balkan Peninsula. So if you're talking about those areas, and then the modern distribution of malaria also includes Southeast Asia, the Philippines. If you look at where malaria used to be, the mutation that causes sickle cell disease is a mutation in hemoglobin, which is the pigment that carries oxygen and also causes our blood to look red. So that mutation arose spontaneously. It was kind of a spontaneous thing that just happened. But as it turned out, people who had that mutation actually were able to survive malaria, and many people got malaria. And so it's those people who survived the malaria who were able to carry on that gene to their descendants.
So how is it that what started out as an advantage somehow seems to be a disadvantage?
Correct. So inheritance of one copy of the gene from mom or dad causes the person, when they get malaria, not to have severe forms of malaria. And it's actually specific to one type of the parasite, one type of malaria parasite. Now, this malaria parasite is found in the Middle East, in India, in the Mediterranean, in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's how the sickle cell trait became so prevalent in these areas, is frankly because the people who had the sickle cell trait survived. They were able to carry on that gene. So having one copy of the trait was an advantage. But if mom and dad had a copy of a trait each, a quarter of their children, 25%, could inherit two copies of that gene.
Now, you mentioned it in, let's say, the Balkans. You mentioned it in Malaysia, various countries in Southeast Asia, the Mediterranean. I am wondering if it's treated differently in other countries than it is treated here. Would any of you know? Would you know, Dr. Nguyen?
Do you mean patients who have the disease?
Yes, just the medical treatment for it.
No, it isn't treated differently than it is treated here. We think of sickle cell disease in the United States as an African American prevalent disease because the majority of patients with sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease, so people with sickle cell trait who have no problems, and patients with sickle cell disease are African American. However, as was noted, correctly noted, it's also seen in the Hispanic population, I believe, primarily because of intermarriage, but it is also seen in people from the Middle East, from India, and from certain parts of the Mediterranean.
Well, talking about treatment, let's talk about is it treated differently from other diseases? So, do you find there's certain health disparities in terms of how people who have sickle cell anemia are treated as opposed to someone who walks in with another disease?
Yes, I believe that the health disparity has been well documented in the literature, and there are a number of initiatives in place now trying to address some of those. But speaking to what you brought up here, many times people who are African American who have sickle cell disease, when they present to certain emergency rooms or healthcare settings, sometimes they're misbelieved that they're in the amount of pain that they're in, and they need the type of narcotics they need to deal with the pain, and it's assumed that they're trying to be drug seeking, or it's assumed that they're trying to avoid something else in the rest of their life. And so, and it's very hard to believe when someone's in pain because you can't see the pain. It's very subjective. Even though we have objective tools for assessing it, they're only indicators. They may not fully represent what that particular individual is experiencing. Many times I've seen with children in school where the teachers do not believe that the child is in pain, particularly when it shows up right about the time that they're supposed to be taking a test. Or even parents struggle sometimes to believe if the child is having a pain episode when there's times of stress around discipline or things that they're supposed to be doing around chores and things of that nature. So there are definitely disparities in that sense. There are also disparities when we look at funding and research in terms of, so for example, the statistics have shown that sickle cell disease is much more prevalent to say cystic fibrosis. However, there's a disparity in terms of the amount of research funds being given to either one to find more work and more cure and more treatment for people living with the disease.